In 1988, a small clause was quietly struck from Israel's penal code, and with it, an entire category of citizens stopped being criminals overnight. Almost nobody marched in the streets that day. There was no headline that shook the nation, but that single legal change was the final chapter of a much longer, stranger story. One that runs through kibbutz communes, rabbinical courts, secret drag festivals, army barracks, and a Tel Aviv beach that would one day be called the gay capital of the Middle East. This is the story of how a nation built on religious law, socialist utopianism, and constant war negotiated one of the most private parts of human life, sex. Today, we're going to trace nearly 80 years of shifting attitudes, hidden lives, landmark court cases, and cultural revolutions inside Israel. We will look at how a country that is home to some of the strictest religious courts in the world also became home one of the most liberal LGBTQ scenes in Asia. Along the way, we will meet kibbutz pioneers who tried to abolish the nuclear family altogether, a gay theater director who lived his whole life in what historians call the transparent closet, and lawmakers who fought quietly and loudly for decades to change what the state was allowed to say about who you could love. Long before the state of Israel existed, the land was governed by Ottoman law, and in 1858, the Ottoman Empire had already decriminalized consensual sodomy in its penal code, provided both parties were of age. That single historical fact surprises most people, because it means that for the first wave of Jewish settlers arriving from Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, the legal environment they moved into was, on paper, less restrictive on private sexual conduct than the empires many of them had fled. But legal codes and lived culture are two very different things. And the early Zionist pioneers who built the first agricultural communes were not thinking about sodomy law. They were thinking about something far more radical, rebuilding the family itself. The early kibbutz movement, inspired by socialist and utopian ideals imported from Russia and Central Europe, treated the traditional nuclear family as a relic of the old world. Founders believed private property, private child rearing, and even private romantic attachment could all be restructured for the good of the collective. Children were raised communally in separate children's houses, meals were eaten together, and for a period, monogamous coupling was viewed with suspicion by some ideologues who saw it as a bourgeois habit standing in the way of true equality. In practice, most kibbutz members still formed couples and long-term partnerships, but the ideology created a genuinely unusual social laboratory, one where sexuality, family, and community were being renegotiated in real time, decades before the rest of the Western world caught up. But if you were gay on a kibbutz in these early decades, the collective's radicalism did not extend to you. Historians studying kibbutz life have described a phenomenon known as the transparent closet, a situation where everyone in a small, tightly bound community quietly knew a member was homosexual, but the subject was never spoken about directly. It was neither fully hidden nor fully accepted. It existed in a strange social fog, tolerated as long as it stayed unspoken. The biography of Giora Manor, a kibbutz-raised choreographer and critic, became one of the clearest documented cases of this dynamic, showing how an entire intimate community could know and simultaneously not know. There was also a quieter, more everyday layer to sexuality in the pre-state Jewish community, one shaped less by ideology and more by sheer demographics. Waves of migration meant the population skewed young, unmarried, and far from extended family oversight. Traditional matchmaking structures that had governed courtship in the shtetls of Eastern Europe weakened dramatically once people were resettled into agricultural collectives or crowded new cities like Tel Aviv, which was itself barely 2 decades old by the time statehood arrived. Young men and women worked side by side in the fields, ate in shared dining halls, and lived in close quarters, conditions that inevitably produced new, looser norms around courtship, simply because the old chaperone structures had no way to survive the move. Now here is where the story takes its first real turn, because everything we have just described happened before the state itself was even founded. Once Israel declared independence in 1948, an entirely new and far more powerful institution stepped into the bedroom, organized religion backed by the full authority of law. When Israel was established, the new government made a fateful decision regarding personal status. Instead of creating a single civil framework for marriage, divorce, and family law, it preserved the Ottoman-era millet system, handing authority over marriage and divorce to religious courts. For the Jewish majority, that meant the Orthodox rabbinate controlled who could legally marry whom inside the country. Civil marriage did not exist. Interfaith couples could not marry in Israel at all. Couples of the same sex certainly could not. This single administrative choice, made in the chaos of a newborn state fighting for survival, would shape Israeli sexual and family politics for the next 70 years, and its effects are still being fought over today. This arrangement did more than regulate weddings. Because religious courts controlled divorce as well, women in unhappy or even abusive marriages could find themselves trapped for years, sometimes decades, waiting for a husband to grant a religious writ of divorce. a problem that persists in Israeli family law to this day and has become its own long-running feminist cause. And because there was no civil alternative, secular Israelis who wanted nothing to do with religious ceremony had exactly one option if they wanted state-recognized marriage while remaining in the country: submit to a rabbinical process regardless of their personal beliefs, or fly abroad. Meanwhile, the criminal law inherited from the British Mandate period still contained language criminalizing unnatural intercourse, a holdover from British colonial legal codes exported across the empire. Unlike the earlier Ottoman decriminalization, British Mandate law reintroduced criminal penalties for consensual homosexual acts. So paradoxically, the new state of Israel began its life with a criminal code more restrictive on paper than the Ottoman Empire it replaced. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. Despite that law technically remaining on the books through the 1950s and into the 1960s, researchers have found essentially no record of it ever being enforced against consenting adults. It sat there, unused, a kind of legal fossil, while ordinary life moved on around it. In 1963, an Israeli court effectively signaled the law would not be applied, and for the next 25 years, the statute existed almost purely as a symbolic embarrassment rather than an active threat. That contradiction, a criminal law nobody enforced, tells you something important about how the young state handled sexuality generally: official conservatism on the surface, quiet pragmatism underneath. That gap between formal law and lived reality shaped an entire generation's approach to visibility. In the 1950s and 60s, there was no organized gay rights movement in Israel to speak of, no public advocacy groups, no pride marches, nothing resembling the homophile organizations beginning to stir in parts of Western Europe and the United States. Instead, gay and lesbian Israelis navigated a patchwork of unofficial tolerance, coded social circles in Tel Aviv and Haifa, and the same unspoken transparent closet dynamic we saw on the kibbutzim, just scaled up to entire neighborhoods and professional communities. Public figures in theater, dance, and the arts were sometimes quietly known to be gay within their circles decades before they could say so publicly, a pattern historians have traced through figures like Jorah Manor and others whose sexuality was an open secret inside Israel's small, tightly networked cultural elite. By the 1960s and 70s, Israeli society, like much of the world, began feeling the ripple effects of the global sexual revolution. Researchers studying kibbutz adolescence in this period documented a genuine shift. A landmark study published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry in 1977 found that greater sexual freedom among kibbutz teenagers, particularly within stable romantic relationships, was gaining increasing acceptance from both the young people themselves and the adult generation raising them. Sex education programs, some dating back to the youth movements of the 1950s, expanded. Researchers at Israeli universities began publishing studies on the sexual attitudes and knowledge of Israeli youth, treating the subject as a legitimate field of social science rather than something to be whispered about. At the very same time, an entirely separate and fascinating discovery was happening on the kibbutzim, one that had nothing to do with liberation and everything to do with biology. Researchers noticed that children raised together from birth in the same communal children's house almost never married each other as adults, even though there was no religious or legal rule stopping them. This became one of the most famous natural experiments in the study of human mating behavior, later cited globally as strong evidence for what is known as the Westermarck effect. The idea that early childhood proximity produces an automatic aversion to later sexual attraction, functioning as a kind of built-in incest avoidance mechanism. Nobody designed the kibbutz to test this theory. It just happened, and scientists noticed. What makes the finding so striking is that it ran directly against the kibbutz's own founding ideology. The architects of communal child-rearing hoped that raising children together, without the possessiveness of the private nuclear family, might eventually erode the very idea of jealousy, monogamy, even the incest taboo itself, since the whole point was to build a new kind of human being unbound by old social instincts. Instead, biology quietly overruled ideology. The children who grew up sharing bedrooms and bathwater in the same children's house did not fall in love with each other as adults, no matter how thoroughly the adults around them had tried to erase the boundaries between family and community. It became one of the clearest real-world demonstrations that some sexual instincts sit deeper than any social experiment can reach, kibbutz idealism included. The early 1980s also brought Israel face-to-face with the global AIDS crisis, and here the story briefly turns darker. As the epidemic spread internationally, fear and stigma spread with it. And Israel's small, mostly closeted gay community suddenly faced a public health emergency without the organizational infrastructure to respond to it collectively. It was partly out of this crisis that the first real advocacy networks began to form, groups that started as informal support and information channels for men affected by the epidemic, and gradually evolved into the country's first sustained LGBTQ political organizations. The same drag festival culture that would later produce the Woodstock riots in 1998 actually began years earlier as an AIDS fundraising event, meaning one of the most joyful, flamboyant public gatherings in Tel Aviv's history was born directly out of a public health tragedy. By the 1980s, pressure had been building for years from these newly formed advocacy groups and from a broader climate of legal reform to formally erase the dormant sodomy law still sitting in the Penal Code. And in 1988, the Knesset finally repealed it, decriminalizing consensual same-sex relations for good. It was a quiet legislative moment, not a dramatic street celebration, but it opened the door to a decade of rapid change that few could have predicted. Just 4 years later, in 1992, the Israeli Defense Forces lifted its ban on LGBTQ individuals serving openly in the military. A genuinely significant step given how central military service is to Israeli civic identity and social belonging. For a young gay or lesbian Israeli, this meant that one of the most formative national rites of passage was no longer something you had to hide who you were to complete. Then came 1998, and a moment historians now treat as a real turning point in public consciousness, the so-called Woodstock riots. Woodstock was an annual drag festival in Tel Aviv, raising funds for AIDS services. When police attempted to shut the event down as the Jewish Sabbath began, a spontaneous, boisterous demonstration broke out. It became a flashpoint, a visible clash between a religiously influenced state apparatus and an increasingly confident, increasingly public LGBTQ community that was no longer willing to simply disappear when told to. That same year, the Knesset passed a law formally banning workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation. 2 years later, in the year 2000, the first Tel Aviv Pride Parade drew over 200,000 participants, a staggering number that instantly made it one of the largest LGBTQ pride events anywhere in Asia or the Middle East. Tel Aviv would go on to brand itself internationally as a gay-friendly tourist destination, an image the city has actively cultivated for over 2 decades since. The 21st century brought a rapid sequence of legal firsts. In 2005, Israel began recognizing same-sex couples as registered partners with many of the legal protections given to married couples. In 2006, following a court ruling, Israel became the first country in Asia to recognize same-sex marriages performed abroad, even though it still would not perform them domestically, a legal contradiction that persists to this day. In 2009, the Knesset passed a law permitting same-sex couples to adopt children, one of relatively few countries worldwide to do so at that time. And lesbian soldiers could serve openly, and co-parenting couples could even be called up for reserve duty simultaneously. A small but telling detail of how thoroughly the state had normalized these families within its bureaucratic machinery, even while the religious courts controlling marriage itself remained untouched. By 2013, Israel formally recognized same-sex marriages performed overseas at the national registry level, strengthening protections for couples who traveled abroad to marry, often to nearby Cyprus, precisely because civil marriage still did not exist inside Israel itself. This created one of the strangest features of modern Israeli sexuality politics, a country whose courts and civil registries increasingly treated same-sex couples as equals, while its marriage law, still controlled entirely by Orthodox religious authorities, refused to marry them, or for that matter, refused to marry any secular couple, gay or straight, who wanted a civil ceremony on Israeli soil. The Cyprus wedding became such a well-worn path that it turned into something of a cultural institution in its own right. A short flight, a quick civil ceremony recognized the moment the couple landed back home, and a running joke among secular Israelis about the absurdity of having to leave the country to get married in it. Wedding planners in Larnaca and Paphos built entire businesses around Israeli couples, gay and straight, flying over for exactly this reason, turning a legal workaround born of religious politics into a genuine cross-border tradition that persists into the current decade. Not every chapter of this recent history has moved in one direction. In 2018, a controversial law allowing private adoption agencies to discriminate based on sexual orientation triggered nationwide protests and a wave of public anger, showing that the culture war over sexuality in Israel was far from settled. Surrogacy law became another major battleground. For years, state-subsidized surrogacy was available to heterosexual couples and single women, but excluded gay men, a policy that LGBTQ rights organizations fought in the courts for the better part of a decade, before eventually winning expanded access. Outside the LGBTQ story specifically, broader Israeli attitudes toward premarital sex, cohabitation, and sex education have also shifted enormously since the state's founding. What was once controlled almost entirely by religious norms around modesty and family purity has, for much of secular Israeli society, become far more openly discussed, researched, and normalized. Even as ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionist communities have maintained, and in some cases intensified, far more conservative standards, creating two increasingly distinct sexual cultures existing within the same small country. Dating culture itself transformed just as dramatically as the law around it. The generation that came of age in the 1950s and 60s met partners through youth movements, kibbutz work assignments, or the tight social web of small towns and army units. By the 2000s and 2010s, that had given way to the same digital dating apps reshaping courtship everywhere else in the world, but layered onto a uniquely Israeli backdrop. Mandatory military service that throws 18-year-olds from wildly different backgrounds together for years, a small enough population that social and dating circles overlap constantly, and a persistent undercurrent of religious secular tension that still shapes who someone's family expects them to bring home. Surveys of Israeli youth sexual attitudes and knowledge, a research tradition stretching back to the 1970s studies on kibbutz adolescence, even as comprehensive sex education in public schools, remained inconsistent and heavily dependent on whether a school was secular, religious, or ultra-Orthodox in orientation. The 2020s have added yet another layer to this story. The judicial reform crisis that convulsed Israeli politics in 2023 was, at its core, a fight over the power of the courts. But LGBTQ rights advocates warned loudly that weakening judicial oversight would strip away decades of court-driven progress on same-sex recognition, since so much of that progress had come from rulings rather than Knesset legislation in the first place. Mass protests that year saw LGBTQ flags flying, alongside pro-democracy banners, a visible sign of how tightly the sexual rights story had become woven into the broader question of what kind of state Israel wanted to be. Then came the war that began in October 2023, which reshaped nearly every part of Israeli public life, including this one. Reservists called up for extended duty included openly gay and lesbian soldiers serving alongside their peers without controversy, a striking contrast to the closeted military culture of just a few decades earlier, even as the broader national focus shifted overwhelmingly toward survival and security. By the mid-2020s, debates continued over surrogacy access, transgender legal recognition, and the unresolved question of civil marriage, proving that even after nearly 80 years, this negotiation between religious authority and secular life was still very much unfinished business. And that tension between a religiously governed legal foundation laid in 1948 and a secular, cosmopolitan society that grew up around and past it is really the thread running through this entire 80-year story. Israel never had a single sexual revolution the way some Western countries did. Instead, it has had a decades-long, still unfinished negotiation between rabbinical courts that still control who can marry, a military and civil bureaucracy that increasingly treats LGBTQ citizens as equal, a kibbutz movement that once tried to reinvent the family from scratch, and a Tel Aviv beachfront that markets itself globally as one of the most liberated cities on earth. Same country, same 80 years, wildly different sexual worlds, still coexisting, still negotiating, right up to today. Look back across the whole timeline and the pattern becomes impossible to miss. 1958, Ottoman decriminalization inherited on paper but overwritten by British mandate law. 1963, a quiet court decision that stopped enforcement without ever repealing the statute. 1988, formal decriminalization. 1992, the military opens its ranks. 2000, the largest pride parade in the Middle East. 2005 through 2013, a decade of court-driven recognition for partnership, adoption, and marriage recognition abroad. And running underneath every single one of those milestones, unchanged since 1948, the same religious courts still holding exclusive control over who gets married on Israeli soil in the first place. 80 years of momentum built almost entirely around one foundational contradiction the state has never fully resolved. If you found this history as strange and layered as I did, that same push and pull between religious law and secular liberalization shows up across almost every institution in Israeli society, not just sexuality. Let me know in the comments which part surprised you most and subscribe for the next deep dive into the hidden social history of the Middle East.